Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was a great ruler and led Egypt to prosperity and made Egypt into a better empire. She led Egypt for approximately 22 years and had great political ambition. In 30 BCE, Cleopatra, queen of Egypt and lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, takes her life following the defeat of her forces against Octavian, the future first emperor of Rome. What if Cleopatra didn't commit suicide at all? What if she was murdered? Based on lack of evidence and proof, Cleopatra did not commit suicide. She was murdered by Octavian, the future ruler of Rome and adopted son of Julius Caesar. Since no contemporary account exists of Cleopatra's life, it is difficult to piece together her biography with much certainty. Cleopatra was a daughter of Ptolemy, also known as Autolycus. Upon the apparently natural death of Autolycus, the Egyptian throne passed on to 18-year-old Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII in 51 BCE. She dedicated her efforts to enforce her royal status as Queen of Egypt. At this time, Julius Caesar had just died. Now she returned back to Egypt, and she was ruling with her son as her co-regent. Her hold on power was even more secure in Egypt. Meanwhile, a conflict was raging in Rome between a second triumvirate of Caesar's allies, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, and his assassins Brutus and Cassius. After Caesar's allies' victory, Mark Antony and Octavian divided power in Rome. Mark Antony then called Cleopatra to Tarsus to explain what her position was in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra went to Tarsus in a ship dressed as Isis, and he was seduced just like Julius Caesar. He then agreed to protect Egypt and her throne and promises to get rid of her rival, her sister Arsinoe. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, and Mark Antony also left Rome and left his kids and his wife Fulvia and decided to stay in Alexandria along with Cleopatra in the winter of 41 to 40 BCE. In 40 BCE, after Antony's return to Rome, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. When Fulvia died, Antony was forced to marry Octavian's sister Octavia. Egypt was prospering, and Antony then met again with Cleopatra to obtain funds for his long-delayed military campaign against the kingdom of Parthia. In exchange, Cleopatra gets to retrieve as much of Egypt's empire. They again become lovers, and Cleopatra gave birth to another son, Ptolemy Philadelphos, in 36 BCE. After a humiliating defeat in Parthia, he publicly rejected his wife Octavia's efforts to rejoin him and instead returned to Egypt to Cleopatra. In 34 BCE, Antony declared Caesarion as Caesar's son and rightful heir, as opposed to his adopted son Octavian, and awarded land to each of his children with Cleopatra. This began a war of propaganda between him and Octavian, who claimed that Antony was entirely under Cleopatra's control and would abandon Rome and found a new capital in Egypt. In 32 BCE, the Roman Senate stripped Antony of all his titles, and Octavian declared war on Cleopatra. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, Octavian's forces had defeated those of Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium. Cleopatra's forces deserted the battle and fled to Egypt, and Antony also managed to escape and followed her forces. Alexandria was under attack from Octavian's forces, and Antony heard that she died by committing suicide, and he fell on his sword, and he died just as soon as the news arrived that the rumor had been false. According to Plutarch, on August 12, 30 BCE, after burying Antony and being under Octavian's control, Cleopatra closed herself into her chamber with two of her female servants. Her death is not certain, but Plutarch says she died by using an asp, a poisonous snake that symbolizes divine royalty, and she let it bite her body. And the maidens were also dead at the scene. At her wish, her body was buried with Antony's, and Octavian became the ruler of Rome. Many historians and writers kept repeating that she committed suicide along with her two handmaidens after Octavian had conquered her empire. She is also believed to have taken her life to prevent the victorious Octavian from carrying her back to Rome in chains and humiliating her by displaying her in his triumph. Her story of her life and death tells the same story written by Plutarch, but Plutarch had written the story some 100 years after she died, and who knows how he had gotten this information. Everyone has seen the painting of her death, sprawled half naked and dead on a couch in her tomb. Some show a snake wrapped around her arm. One handmaiden diseased on the floor, and the other one near death, placing a crown on Cleopatra's head. At some point after this, the snake makes an exit out of the sealed tomb room, and Octavian's men arrive too late to prevent the queen from taking her life, and she had just sent a suicide note to Octavian. And Cleopatra's mausoleum is known to have been located close to a palace where Octavian was living in Alexandria. As the story goes, Cleopatra was in her mausoleum when she wrote out a suicide note, which was given to a guard and delivered to Octavian. It is apparently soon after that she held a snake, known as an asp, to her breast and was bitten and killed. Apparently, Plutarch says that she managed to smuggle a snake into the tomb in a basket of figs past a Roman guard, and now Octavian was a ruler. The story, however, is really unbelievable. If she really wanted to die, she would have used poison, which was a faster and more efficient alternative rather than a cobra. The right poison can achieve a quicker and more pleasant death than the Egyptian cobra. It can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 5 or more hours to die from the bite of this cobra. Cleopatra would have suffered an agonizingly slow exit from life, while the neurotoxins paralyzed her breathing muscles, and finally she would have suffocated to death. Then her handmaidens have watched the horrifying state of their queen in front of them, would have repeated her action. One still has to wonder that her two handmaidens, having watched the horrifying state of their queen in front of them, would have been brave enough to grab the snake, especially having witnessed exactly what would happen to them if they got anywhere near the snake. Furthermore, with the likelihood of any bites, which happens a good percentage of the time, one strike of the snake might not do the trick, and one wouldn't know until some time had passed whether any venom was injected. If none had been released, then the snake would have to be handled yet again with a second or third bite. For all three women to be quickly successful in having the cobra to kill them is quite unlikely. This is also assuming that there would have been a guard dumb enough to allow that snake through the front door. Wouldn't it have been easier to smuggle into the tomb a small amount of poison, or one's body, or if one must smuggle it in later, inside one of the figs? One should also think about the snake. Where did that snake go after the last handmaiden dropped it? It wasn't in the sealed tomb when Octavian's men arrived. In fact, according to Plutarch, they didn't even bother to look around for the lethal reptile. The physician simply examined the woman, and with a nary sign being killed by any snake, he pronounced the woman's cause of death to be that of the viper venom. Plutarch's tale was suspect since it lacks logic, science, and evidence. There were so many red flags that popped up from the pages of the historical accounts of the Egyptian queen's final day. Octavian is also a key factor in her death. Why would Octavian supposedly be so adamant about taking Cleopatra to Rome for his triumph, be so lax about her imprisonment? The real story of her death is that Cleopatra never loved Antony or Caesar. Antony was murdered, and Cleopatra was murdered and strangled to death by Octavian. Cleopatra may have been one of the most brilliant, cold-blooded, iron-willed rulers in history, and the truth about what really happened was hidden behind a veil of propaganda and lies set in motion by her murderer, Octavian, and the agenda of the Roman Empire. In the documentary The Unsolved Death of Cleopatra from Discovery Channel, Pat Brown, a criminal profiler and writer, decided to solve the case of Cleopatra's mysterious death and figured out what actually had happened on the night of her death. This relates to her murder because Brown uses many devices and resources to find out what had happened to her, and it turns out that she was actually murdered by Octavian, Rome's new ruler. In conclusion, Plutarch's story of Cleopatra's death was not real due to the fact of lack of evidence and proof, and Cleopatra was murdered. She did not commit suicide at all. She was murdered by Octavian, Rome's new leader.